thank you all for coming today. We really appreciate, again, meeting with us for another executive work group meeting. We will, as we have been at the end of today's agenda, talk about the next time that we're all together as well. And thank you just for coming. I think that we have Michael with us today. Cynthia is gone, and so we had Justin with us from yesterday at Funding and Governance, Michael today, so thank you for filling in her stead.
And we also have Commissioner Tymancer filling in for Commissioner Hutchings.
Thank you so much for joining us as well. Yep. So I think with that, we are recording the meeting as we typically do for the executive work group. We will also be documenting our discussion with our objective of posting that to the website within 1 month following our meeting. Wonderful, good morning. No, you're just fine. So as we dive in today, first I wanted to see if there were any general questions, or if any folks do have to leave a little bit early. Jeff, you mentioned you might have to.
Can I leave now?
A little bit longer.
Oh, okay.
Just stay a little longer.
I'll try to last as long as possible.
Okay, thank you. All right. So our first agenda item is to provide an EIS schedule update. And part of that pertains to a slightly updated process map that you should have in your meeting materials in front of you. We will also be posting this to the website as well. The processes and topics to be covered at work group has all remained the same. What we have updated is just the schedule. So what you will see in the upper right is that we are identifying the draft EIS to now be issued in mid-2021 rather than December 2020, and the final EIS expected to be issued in 2022. And that project schedule revision is based on the delays affecting the Bathymetric Survey due to the Olympia Brewery oil spill. So it's what we've been discussing, where in the spring we had been targeting our ability to collect bathymetric data, which is a critical input parameter or data set to the sediment and transport and hydrodynamic modeling. Due to the oil spill, we were not able to access the lake and conduct that survey. We have had our bathymetric survey contractor go out into the lake just a week ago and assess the current vegetation conditions. The vegetation is starting to die off, it's improving, but there's still significant vegetation cover in the shoreline and the majority of the middle basin, such that it would be challenging, but also could have impacts to the quality of the Bathy data. And as it's a critical component to the modeling, we want to make sure we have high quality, accurate data. So the bathymetric survey is targeted to be conducted at the end of this year, first week in January, in coordination with Enterprise Services and their knowledge around the vegetation die-off. That's when we'll be able to really get in, not have issues with the quality of data, and proceed on our way. So it has,
Just a question about the vegetation die-off. This is a regular seasonal occurrence, not necessarily related, not necessarily due to the oil spill.
That's a great point, yes. This is the normal vegetation annual or seasonal cycle.
I would just add a quick note there that when we were able to get back on the lake after the ecology spill cleanup had been completed, we went out there to attempt to complete the survey, but that was at the peak of the growth.
Right.
And so, as Jesse mentioned, getting back out, we've just been monitoring conditions so that we can be back out there as soon as we can once that die-off has happened, the annual die-off.
Right. Go ahead, Jeff.
Though I generally think of an extension of the schedule as a conspiracy to outlast me.
Me too.
So just to make that note, I can't help but point out the irony of your needing to extend the schedule due to poor water quality conditions resulting in a very unhealthy water body, such that you can't even take successful measurements.
Comment noted. So what we have done is made sure that the technical analysis that are independent or are not directly relying upon the bathymetric data can get underway, but the bathymetric data ties into the sediment transport modeling, that is the backbone of a several analysis built off of those results as well. So that is the shift in our ability to start those analysis, and therefore the shift in the timing of the delivery of the EIS. We are, absorbing as much as we can, but that's really where we're at. So that's what we wanted to communicate, and just have the opportunity to answer any additional questions.
Well, how are we gonna convey this to the legislature? We're asking for more money, right? So does that mean this money would not be needed until the next biennium, or?
Right now, we're having conversations. We have articulated to the legislature that there has been a delay. We're working closely with OAP and the governor's office to see how the spend is, going to be impacted by the delay of the study. So those conversations are happening.
But this would mean it would, at a minimum, the final EIS wouldn't get out until the next biennium. So at least there would be some cost pushed over
Yep,
to the
that's
next
correct.
biennium, which might make it easier to get. That's that part of the funding.
I agree.
Okay.
But it's better to get it now, a bird in the hand.
I think the message is we're still driving to get the full funding. Right now, whether or not we need to get a reappropriation, that has been our message, is we need to have full funding
Yep.
regardless. So, and we're sticking by that.
Any other questions on either the survey or the schedule shift? And again, we'll post the updated process map on the website, and we've communicated the schedule shift yesterday to the Funding and Governance Work Group, as well as last week with the Community Sounding Board. Our Funding and Governance Work Group efforts and tasks, as we've talked about, are parallel and somewhat separate. So really from that perspective, we stay the course with our funding and governance work, with the draft funding and governance framework coming into the draft EIS that's just shifted in time. And I think that brings us to the third bullet under our first agenda item. We just wanted to provide a little bit of a briefing on our funding and governance work group meeting yesterday. We followed up from the joint September meeting that we had with funding and governance and the executive work group. We went through some revisions that were made to the supplementary governance and funding tables. Michael, some of your input in particular on the joint municipal authority framework is incorporated. Also some comments that were received on federal funding or public funds, etc. So that was just a small item. And then the majority of the meeting yesterday was spent on an exercise of asking the work group members from their perspective, their organizational perspective, what did they see as some of the key or priority benefits of the long-term management project. So there was a DOT exercise. We also assessed and asked that question relative to cost components and contribution to cost. It was a tool or next step in the evolution of drilling down from all of the models that are out there for funding and governance, and then our ability to look at how a customized approach for that shared funding would come into play. So we had all of the organizations and agencies represented except the port, and we want to make sure that they are participating in that exercise and that their views are represented as well. So we'll be reaching out to the port to even just show them photographs of our DOT exercise and asking for their input so we can incorporate that.
We have no staff there.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah. And so we just want to make sure that we reach out, and if Commissioner Zita, we're kind of keeping you in the loop and reaching out to the director or how best to do that.
She was at a meeting that we have other staff that could fill in, so, yeah, let me know if it, yeah, we'll stay
How
on
best to move forward for that, okay. So I think that again was a productive exercise and led to, I think it was effective in helping us drill down and have some meaningful conversations around the differences in some elements between capital construction and contribution and benefit versus long-term O&M and what that means to the different groups. So we'll keep you informed along those lines of how we develop, and then when we talk about our next executive work group meeting, we can also talk about that similar timing for our next funding and governance meeting as well. kind of just a status update on that. All right.
Before you move off this item, can you summarize the schedule shift again?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Previously, prior to the Bathy delay, the draft EIS was targeted for issuance in December 2020.
Yep.
And now we're expecting issuance in mid-2021. Which we're doing a little bit better than a one-to-one shift. We're absorbing some of that. We had initially targeted conducting the bathymetric survey this past March, April, and then with the oil spill, we weren't able to do that. So we're ending up with a 9-ish month delay in when we could actually do the bathy, but we're trying to shrink that input and allow a lot of the technical analysis to move forward. All the fun, unforeseen conditions on top of things that go. But we're getting there. Any other questions?
I guess I just wanted to make a note of maybe some of the additional input or additions that we made to the process map. Sure. Just with our, because we have a couple extra minutes. This is a living document. We'll continue to update it as we have additional information around how we meet with each of the stakeholder groups. And we committed early on in the process to providing additional detail as we forecast what our activities were in 2020 as we're leading up to the draft EIS. And so the revision does show that there is an additional round of meetings currently planned with each of our stakeholder groups in 2020. We're going to be working with each one and with our EIS project team to kind of understand and define the exact frequency of that, recognizing that over the last year we've laid the foundation well and received input on how we move forward to the draft. And then at some point we put our nose down and we do some work. So there could be a greater duration between meetings, but continuing to stay engaged with each of you. So we wanted to point that out. And then the last thing to point out is just that we've added on this document just additional definition around our key milestones, our key outputs from the funding and governance work group, recognizing that our intention would be to summarize how our potential draft agreements as part of our EIS documents, so syncing those two milestones. So that would mean that a draft framework for shared funding could be somehow summarized or represented in the draft EIS.
And that was consistent with the September discussion and reviewing of the funding and governance process map that we had.
Yeah, exactly. We just brought that over here now. And then similarly with the final. So just a couple. Those are the only other additions that have been made to this process map, just to be aware of.
Going back a little bit, when I report out on this, what will we be getting back from the Bathy report? I'm not a scientist, so
No,
what
it's a great question.
that influence?
Yes, so the last bathymetric survey that was done for Capitol Lake was in 2013. This survey now will let us understand what the current sediment elevations are within the basins. That also helps us to ground truth or understand the rate of deposition. We can compare back now 2004, 2013, and then 2019 and understand that change, how much sediment both in location and thickness has come to be deposited in different areas of the lake. So that in and of itself is informative. But that actual bathymetric survey feeds into the sediment transport and hydrodynamic modeling as a key input parameter. And then as you guys know, that modeling and assessment of where sediment is forecasted to go in the future under different alternatives, it ties to and then helps our ecological work and assessment of where habitat zones are and where sediment will be deposited, and if under the various alternatives, particularly under an open system, what might that look like under an open system, and then lets the team further compare the alternatives and evaluate potential impacts. So it ends up just a critical component.
The foundation for all of that modeling.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Jessica, could you go back over your characterization of the integration of the funding and governance options into confused, perhaps concerned about the implications of that.
Yeah, thanks for stopping me there. And I did breeze through that quickly. So the intention is that through our work with the Funding and Governance Work Group, between now and when we issue a draft, our goal is to develop a draft framework for shared funding and governance that could be common across all alternatives. So what are the commonalities here? What could we agree on and essentially apply to all alternatives, recognizing that they will all have upfront construction costs, all have upfront maintenance costs, but also recognizing that there will be changes to how that looks based on the final alternative selected. But where we would start is there generally a draft framework that could work for this project, and then that would be reflected in the draft EIS. From there, that would be sort of that would be our first key milestone with them. From there to the final, the work would be developing that into the framework that worked for the preferred alternative.
So I guess I'm transferring from confused to concerned. I think that that's problematic because I think the nature of a funding and governance product is incumbent upon the option chosen. I mean, you can imagine that, to put it in extreme terms, if we were to choose an estuary option, the tribe would be very supportive of how you come up with the funding and governance. If you chose a lake option, we'd be like, not interested.
Right.
So there's not like a common, we'll go this far but no further. It's more black and white.
And I think we're definitely aware of that, and even yesterday part of the cost component exercise was really that distinction of understanding here's the elements that are common across alternatives and here's those that aren't, and recognizing that and really kind of customizing to where we're at, and because these alternatives are so drastically different, the approach that the team takes to still identify what mechanisms of funding or governance make sense when you're trying to still not be ahead of a preferred alternative. So for example, exactly what you were saying, one of the discussions we had amongst the work group was, let's say your project element that you're identifying cost components or you're evaluating benefit and who should contribute to the cost component is management of sediment. Well, the entity's feelings or thoughts on both their interest in contributing to the cost component and their responsibility is very different under a closed and open system. For example, one of the dialogue discussions we had, and this is just an example, is if you were looking at the management of sediment under an open system, entities may be more interested in contributing a funding model to that because they want to or have responsibility to contribute to the viability of a working waterfront. But under a closed system with the dam in place, they might not have that same interest or responsibility to contribute to long-term maintenance dredging because it's just about the North Basin, for example. So we definitely are grappling with an understanding that some of those elements are so drastically different across the alternatives, it absolutely impacts any given organization's perspective on both their responsibility to contribute to funding or governance and their interest to do so. So we're definitely aware of that and taking that information in, and part of the exercise yesterday was teasing a bit of that apart. So we are still evaluating the most productive path forward that recognizes those differences in the draft EIS.
I think what I heard you describe was based on whether an individual entity would want to participate in whatever model was developed for whatever option was being considered. understand that that may be a consideration, but I think I was referring more to the extreme circumstance where if the particular option wasn't supported, that we wouldn't want any proposal structure going forward.
I can understand.
We might prefer to see the thing continue to be mired in, well, let's just say stuck in the mud.
I totally understand, and I think that's why the continued engagement with funding and governance and talking through these things and that point, including the tribe's position on that, is absolutely why that process is continuing in parallel with the draft EIS. So, comment noted, definitely understand. All right. I think that brings us to our next agenda item. This is review and discussion of the EIS technical methodologies. So last time we met just with the executive work group, we met in September with our joint meeting with funding and governance, but when we met in June with the executive, we overviewed a few of those technical methodologies. Water quality, sediment transport was one of those. We, this afternoon, will be meeting with the technical work group, and we will go into even greater detail on these methodologies as we do, and asking for their technical and regulatory perspective and input as well. But we want to make sure that you guys keep informed and have a sense of the work to be conducted. And then it's been really helpful, the feedback we've received from the executives as well, whether that pertains to the questions around the extent of the study area or engagement in resources or whatnot. So,
Just check in. If it appears that there is not likely to be port staff at that meeting, let me know and I'll see what I can do.
okay, thank you. We appreciate that. So I think with that, I will hand it over to Tessa to start us off with an overview of the aquatic invasive species methodology.
Sure, sounds good. So as Jesse mentioned, we'll get into more detail this afternoon, and we have some specific questions for the regulatory agencies that'll be with us, but we want to keep you apprised. And so what you're seeing on this initial slide is the current thinking around the study area that would be applied specific to aquatic invasive species. And as we've discussed before, the study areas for each technical discipline are tailored to the area of potential impact for that specific discipline. So this is the area that we anticipate evaluating for aquatic invasive species. And what it roughly extends to right now is about 100 feet off from the shoreline around the Capitol Lake Deschutes estuary. And then the north-south extent would be north to Boston, extending to Boston Harbor, and south to Tumwater Falls, and noting that it extends up Percival Creek to Highway 101. This probably looks familiar because it's consistent with the Fish and Wildlife Study area. Those, of course, would be well synced, and so that is our initial thinking around what we would be looking at for the scope of the aquatic invasive species.
Quick question. You said that it extended it north to Boston Harbor, but that line doesn't go north to Boston Harbor on the slide.
Priest Point Park.
Yeah.
Yeah, Priest Point Park there. Yep, we will get that. We'll have to get that adjusted.
Yes, just the boat on West Bank.
Which are you going to adjust, the map or the wording?
The map.
The words are right, the map's wrong.
The words right.
Right.
Right?
Yep. I think we're good there. Okay. So our anticipated methodology is to begin evaluating existing conditions using existing data. There is good data within Capitol Lake regarding the type and density of aquatic invasive species. And those would be evaluated by our technical lead. And Additionally, though, recognizing that our resource agencies also have some good information around that, so specifically the Department of Fish and Wildlife, they have been very interested in sharing that information and collaborating with us, and so we'll be mining their data and also other aquatic invasive species databases that are maintained and held by other agencies. We'll be looking into species-specific literature as well, and so the intent of that is to generally understand, how these species move, populate, regenerate in different types of systems, how they grow, what their transport looks like. So that's the one side, to establish our existing conditions. Coming out of that, we'll put together a map that really does show the most current understanding of aquatic invasive species within the project area. Sure, go ahead.
Sorry, one more question regarding this specifically. Will part of that report come back talking about where these species exist in other waterways and how they're managing them?
We will be looking at other sites to the extent that they're applicable to the work that we're doing here. Yes. Yep, absolutely. Go ahead, Jeff.
You probably have already provided this, but do we have a list of what invasive species you'll be considering?
Yes, we do. And I would offer initially the following, but then say that our technical lead may have more to add to that. So, of course, the New Zealand mud snail, the purple loosestrife, milfoil, and what is the last one, Jessie?
Canadian geese.
Canadian geese.
Yellow flag island.
Oh, yes.
That's what it is.
Yeah.
I mean, there's nutria, I don't know if that,
Upland
looking at that.
noxious species. Those would be,
Nutria,
Okay.
a legitimate issue.
which species we're
Nutria.
looking at. I'm sorry, could you say that again?
Nutria.
Nutria. Can
You're
you say your
considering
comment
them?
again?
You're considering them?
We will confirm. I have not specifically spoken about nutria to our technical lead, but we can confirm that and get back to you. Jen.
Yeah, what about invasive fish species?
Invasive fish species?
Yes.
This would be, his focus for in-water would be plant species and could also be looking at those upland species. We'll speak to our biologist about potential fish species.
And I mean, things like, say, bullfrog. I mean, my point, I guess, is that I would expect this type of survey to be thorough of virtually all invasive species.
Real or potential, but depending
Yeah.
on the alternative, there might be other species that could land in our area too. If there's a certain alternative, what's the potential based on each alternative for what could happen? Not just what is happening. Does that make sense?
Totally.
Susceptibility.
Yes.
California
So-
sea lions.
The global warming, they're gonna come up here.
They are already here, and some people consider them to be invasive. This is way beyond their normal traditional range. So, there could be some debate about how to or whether to include some species, but again, I hope that consideration would be thorough and not just the select headline species that we've already been dealing with.
What we can do is get back to Jeff or the group with the species list that our technical lead will be putting together
Yeah, and
now.
the group it's up to them, I'm a biologist, so these kind of things are relevant to me.
Right, of course, absolutely. And I am not.
Could you go back to the map?
Sure.
So you're gonna take it up to the dam on the river, that's what that shows roughly, is that what you're?
That's right.
And then on the Bristol Creek, is there a reason for the break at 101? Is that?
It goes under the state.
Yeah, my initial understanding about the reason for the break is just wanting to understand the potential change to salinity and how that system will initially move under the different systems. And again, that was driven when they were initially looking at our biological resources, so fish and wildlife, how that would change. And the thinking was having the two disciplines synced was right here. Those two technical leads spoke and felt that this was the best.
Appropriate extent.
Well,
Yeah.
I guess I'd just make a couple of points. One is, if you follow the Purcell ditch, if you will, to the west, I think once you get a little bit west of Mottman Road, there's a control structure there related to the stormwater. I think the stormwater pond, that one get built, I'm not positive, but that might be a more natural break point. And the true Purcell Creek to the south, you're east of that yet. There's a branch that splits just past 101 and comes to the south, and I don't know if you want to look at the relative, I guess it kind of depends on what you're looking at. If
Kind of
you're
by
looking,
SBSCC?
yeah, if you're looking at them as sources of invasive species that feed into the lake, that might be an important distinction to look at those two branches there. We haven't really talked about that, but yeah, the south branch goes through SBSCC. There may be some data on that segments of that water body. I don't know.
Okay. Got that down. Commissioner Zita, were you going to offer something? Okay. We'll take this back to our lead, and again, the project area was initially defined as the area that could change either with a beneficial impact or an impact from project-related from the project. And so about how implementing our project changes outward, and this is how we initially defined it. But we have notes to see if we need to update this for the info. Okay, so let's go back to that last slide. So given, once we've evaluated the site-specific data, the data from our regulatory agencies, and have an understanding of how these species move in terms of their distribution, habitat growth, they will be looking at various methods to control or eradicate the invasive species. So that's a huge part of this, is understanding what we can do and recognizing that those opportunities to either control or eradicate will likely vary across the open and closed systems. And so that'll be included in our exercise. And so we can go to the next slide and talk a little bit more about that. I don't want to take up all the time, so I'm going to breeze through this, but generally what we want to understand in terms of our impact related to the project on aquatic invasive species are what does this do to change the aquatic ecosystem, and also what does this do to change recreation in the project area, and these can either be impacts or benefits from the project. And so we'll be looking at impacts and benefits based on change in density and spatial coverage of the aquatic invasive species. So this is for each of the species on the species list that we'll define. The potential for the species to move and establish outside of the project area or not. That's also a potential, because our work would be to control it within the project area or eradicate altogether. And that brings us to the next point about the possibility and the potential to eradicate the species, the management options for those species as we've discussed. And then how those control and eradication methods may affect other species. So for example, this afternoon we'll have a discussion with a technical work group about the potential use of a molluscicide that of course would help to potentially control the New Zealand mud snail, but could have other impacts on other species within the project area. So we'd want to talk about the trade-offs there. And then of course looking at how this work impacts our recreational resources. And we we will conduct this impact analysis using a variety of inputs, so one of them being our numerical modeling, and then also the habitat and control and existing conditions maps that we'll be generating, and additional coordination with our other technical resources like biological resources. That's sort of the scoop there. Again, to be discussed in more detail this afternoon.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
You keep mentioning this afternoon. Am I here all day?
You're
I didn't
free.
plan-
Yes.
There's a different group you're meeting.
The technical work group is this afternoon.
Okay.
Yes.
And hopefully you've got staff that are coming.
Any other questions on that before we move on to the next methodology? Okay, so that brings us to historic and cultural resources, which is a key element. I guess we say that for almost every methodology. Capitol Lake has just so many different layers to it, but particularly in this area, both from a cultural perspective and a built environment perspective. So the first slide just provides an overview or a sense of the resources that are evaluated under this work in the EIS. First, from the archaeological perspective, archaeological resources by definition are encompassing features and deposits located on or below the ground surface that are evidence of prior human occupation or use. So that can be historic or pre-contact. For relative to historic resources, these are elements of the built environment. So these are buildings, structures, landscapes, man-made or human-made objects. And finally, traditional cultural properties. These are sites or locations that are culturally important to the history of a group of people, and or locations where culturally important events or practices were known to occur. So because of those three pertinent elements of this work, if you don't mind going to the next slide, the primary sources of information for this element of the EIS are meetings and discussions with the tribes, DAP, and other stakeholders at a primary level to start off and really feed that key information into. That is hand in hand with desktop sources. So that's a compilation of data from previous surveys, inventories, and historic records. So within our EIS team, we have leads that are from the archaeological perspective, the archaeologists themselves, and then also the built environment. Very, very different historical elements. We have, leading up to the overview of this work with you today and the technical work group this afternoon, been able to connect with the Squaxin Island tribe and receive some of their initial input, as well as Sean, your new archaeologist that you have within your team and your staff, received some of his thoughts on really kind of key elements from his perspective. And then earlier this week, we were also able to have a meeting with DAP, both the DAP archaeologist assigned to this area and then also their built environment lead. So in doing that, we were able to walk through our literature work ahead of us. Basically, this is the desktop or windshield survey as part of this EIS work. Just to be really clear, and we've had these discussions with both the tribe and DAP, we are not including any field work, any exploration or exploratory borings as part of the EIS, but rather assessing all of the historical records that are available to our team. So that's kind of to lead us to today as we embark upon the work, some of the early coordination or input that we've received. And that, oh, go ahead.
Can you explain what historical borings would show us if we did them?
Besides going through our footprints where we have fill material or recent sediments have come to be deposited, it would give us information on native layers, pre-contact layers, or information that's in the subsurface that may have particularly archaeological significant elements in it. We're not planning on doing any of those investigations or ground disturbance. So for example, when a project is further into the design and there are field investigations to get empirical data to support the design, particularly in regions with either historical or archaeological significance. There's inadvertent discovery plans and archaeological monitoring that occurs as part of that work. For this project, following selection of the preferred alternative, we would expect that that work would be occurring as the preferred alternative design advances.
Further on, it would
Exactly.
occur.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. But in this work, we're just not needing to do that level of work. And we've talked that through as well with DAP and the tribe.
Thank you.
Jeff?
So you have said a couple of times tribe, singular.
Mm-hmm.
Your graphic says tribes, plural. We talked a little bit about this before. Where are you going with that?
No, absolutely. I think some of this primary sources is also to provide the context of typically the sources of information are the local tribes within the area as well as DAP and other stakeholders. So right now we have not reached out and actively requested information from a tribe beyond the Squaxin Island tribe. We have provided notification to the Nisqually tribe under scoping and kept, as a stakeholder, everyone informed of the project development. But relative to this work, that tribes is a more general source of information.
So just continue to make the point as a warning that be careful where you go with that. It easily gets complicated.
Got it. All right. With that, if we go to the next slide. Like I mentioned, the archaeological resources element of this is coupled with the historic resources. They both have similar but different approaches, so we wanted to walk you through or provide an overview of that. Starting with our archaeological resources work, our process is to gather data on recorded sites, identify areas where potential sites may be located, and identify areas of potential fill. So this is fill modeling based on the existing geotech data, the previous work that the Squaxin Island tribe, the city of Olympia, DAP has done, and then also historic shoreline maps. So the team is looking through a wealth of information to understand how the shoreline and fill layers, or topography bathymetry, because it's once was bathymetry is now topography here, how that has changed historically over time as well. And then also determine impacts by evaluating if construction and operations would affect resources listed or eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places and or protected under Washington state law. So that's part of the archaeological resources approach. And then when we come to the historic resources or the built environment, the first part really is the data gathering mode, kind of similar here. Developing historic context, evaluating connections and relationships. This can also include historic neighborhoods or view sheds that are pertinent to the built environment, providing recommendations for eligibility, conducting analysis of impacts. And what we talked through in particular with DAP on this are the key elements here that really are kind of unique to the Capitol Lake area, are looking at the historic resources regarding Deschutes Estuary, Capitol Lake itself, which has a relationship, the designed landscape has a relationship with Olympia and Tumwater, obviously, and relationships with Wilder and White and the Olmsted brothers. Also assessing and looking at the adjacent railroads, the City of Olympia historic districts, listed and inventoried properties, the same for City of Tumwater, and the West Capitol campus. So there's quite a bit within the Capitol Lake area or our EIS study area. This afternoon with the technical work group, again, similar to what Tessa was saying on invasive species, we'll be probing and going a little bit deeper. We'll also have one of our discipline leads with us on this front as well. And we have a member of DAP that is a participant in the technical work group that will also be available as a resource to us moving forward.
As a resource, have you research that Emmett O'Connell has done?
I would have to ask our team to see, I know I recognize that name being mentioned, but I'd have to see what level of detail or the resources.
Sure. I'm not actually sure where Emmett works now.
Auditor's office.
Oh, Emmett O'Connell.
But he's somewhat of among other things, somewhat of an amateur historian and has done extensive research on the water body. And he writes about it. I think he still is maintaining his blog. If not, I can give you access to some of his writings that are online.
Okay.
It may or may not be useful, but it's probably something we should take a
Worth to
look
look at. Okay, that'd be great.
The one source you haven't mentioned here is DOT. When they expanded the freeway in the late 70s, early 80s, they did some work, I believe.
Oh, okay.
I don't know what else was done prior to that, when the freeway was first put in the 50s. But
They may have done
they
it.
must have done an EIS for the expansion and perhaps done some archaeological work out there. I don't know.
That's a great suggestion.
And then, did you get the listing, the historic district listing document that I think I
Yes.
emailed to you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Not to get into mission creep at all, which is really easy to do when you start talking about digging in. There is a request for an I-5-101 interchange study, right, for capacity, and they're looking, maybe you can help me with this, because you're the TBD board, right? There's talk about, that being outdated and not functioning. So they redo that whole interchange, which is right over this body of water. There might be some synergy between the work that you're doing that would impact any kind of interchange expansion there. That, maybe just noted in the back of your mind that there,
Okay.
as far as asking for funding, when you go to the legislature, and just say this could also inform that future study, so it's worth investing in it now. I mean, 'cause it's definitely going to impact. If they redo that interchange, it's a huge, huge project right over this body of water.
Are they asking for funding for that right now?
It's mostly study, it's in the study phase right now, it's just
Right.
traffic modeling is all they've done.
Yeah, that's the word, traffic.
And the modeling shows that the benefit would just push everything up to exit 105. It would just create the exact same conglomeration of
And doesn't
traffic.
expand that, the interchange there?
They tried to model what was proposed, and it systemically didn't have any positive impact. That was my understanding of what I saw at KRPC.
Okay. It's been a topic.
I know, but I think it will.
At our shared
It's-
legislative.
It's still discussed, so I'm just throwing that in for.
Yeah. Just kind of tuck it away in the back.
Anyway, yeah, that work will be going on in parallel with your work, probably the best way to say it.
All right. Do you want to say anything about transportation? That's something we had a tentative on the agenda to bring forward an overview of the transportation methodology as well. We think that that's one of the ones that will come forward when we meet next. We've kind of been staggering as we roll those out. So that was just a little shift in time. But we are in close coordination like we've described in the past, reaching out to each of the agencies or organizations through the technical work group. This is one where we have been coordinating with the city of Olympia and their transportation leads or folks to really talk about 4th Avenue, 5th Avenue, what does this mean for transportation? So definitely underway. All right, I think with that moves us to the next agenda item that is an overview of the optimized alternatives that came out of our measurable evaluation process that we reviewed together in June. With that, I'll hand it over to you guys.
Okay. As as you're getting the figures out from your meeting packet, I wanted to take a moment to introduce Stephen Gray. So he is, and then I'll pass it over to you to introduce yourself, but he works very closely with me and Jesse and has been just a key part of developing the optimized alternatives through the measurable evaluation process. Do you want to introduce who you are and who you work for?
Well,
Your role on the team?
I'm leading the design elements of the team, trying to take these measurable criteria and put them into physical aspects on the site. I essentially do a lot of marine-related engineering and design and have for the last 18 plus years with Moffitt and Nickel. I don't know, what else should I say about myself?
He's wonderful.
Yeah, well, thank you.
I think that it's also part of the value that Stephen adds to our team is that he has been the engineering or design lead for other EIS processes. So the ability to really assess how you compare and evaluate alternatives on an appropriate conceptual design level within the context of an EIS,
Yeah.
Which is a little bit unique. And so that's what's been really helpful is bringing that experience to this project as well.
Yeah, it can be hard as an engineer, not getting too deep into the weeds of these alternatives, and just keep it at a level that they need for doing the analysis.
Okay, so with that, the reason why we have this slide on the screen is because what we've brought to you is a result of the measurable evaluation process. And we went through this process with each of our work groups. And so all I'll say about this today is that it was the filter through which the optimized alternatives were developed. So we looked at the existing recommendations and alternatives that had been put forward and compared those against technical and regulatory feasibility and environmental and economic sustainability and developed the project components that would best meet project goals coming through that evaluation. So let's switch to the next slide here. So on the screen is where we'll start. It's the figure for the managed lake alternative. I am going to orient you to these figures. The managed lake might take the longest to walk through, and then we'll get quicker as we go through the three alternatives. So the way this figure is set up is at the top, it's important to note, as I just mentioned, that these components or these optimized alternatives came out of that measurable evaluation process. So that's the kind of the writing at the top right of the figure. In addition to that note, it also conveys that these are draft conceptual designs, and they may continue to be, or it will likely be continually refined in the environmental impact statement. The last thing before we get into this is I want to draw your attention to the bottom, and that is a listing of our key project goals that are common to all alternatives. And what we see on the figure are those components of each alternative that will help to meet project goals. It does not include other potential alternative pieces that may be part of the alternative but not integral to meeting project goals. For example, there has been questions about how would you reduce or minimize potential impacts to historical resources, and we recognize that that needs to be addressed. But it's not on this project figure itself because it's not integrally related to the project goals. The other thing that we are not presenting here are the potential impacts of the alternatives, because that's what our EIS will do for us. So there will likely be figure versions of these when we've completed our technical analysis to convey what the impacts are, but at this point we're not there yet. So that's kind of just setting the table. For the managed lake alternative, I'll walk around this clockwise, starting at the top with our initial maintenance dredging. And so the managed lake alternative that came out of the measurable evaluation process really focuses dredging in the North Basin only. And the reason for that is because it minimizes the extent and associated cost of dredging under the managed lake alternatives while still supporting other project goals such as enhancing ecological functions or improving water quality, for example. So the focused dredging in the North Basin would support recreational use and then would allow the Middle and South Basins to be transitioned to improve ecological and functions and water quality. One of the things that we recognize is that if we don't dredge the Middle and North Basins, what would happen out there is they would slowly transition to freshwater wetlands. What we've also evaluated is an opportunity or approach that would help to establish those freshwater wetlands with the material that we use during our initial maintenance dredge event. And so,
or it's not quite, it's not maintenance dredging.
Or, sorry, yeah,
the beneficial reuse of the dredge material of the dredging of the North Basin to use that in the Middle Basin for habitat creation.
Yep, exactly. Sorry about that. So during our initial dredging event in the North Basin, we would take that material and place it in the Middle and South Basins to construct habitat islands or freshwater wetlands. There are really two reasons for that. Of course, that provides a huge beneficial reuse opportunity, substantially reducing the initial upfront cost of constructing the alternative. We also recognize that through our work with the DMMP that off-site disposal or in-water disposal is not viable. Is there anything you want to say there on that?
Yeah, we communicated this to the funding and governance work group yesterday as well. Early on in 2012-2013, we reached out to the Dredge Material Management Program and we asked for their determination if dredge material from the Capital Lake basins would be found suitable for open water disposal at one of the DMMP sites, with the consideration that the New Zealand mud snails and invasive species are present within that dredge material. Their determination then was that no, due to the potential risk of spread of New Zealand mud snails, as well as purple loosestrife, but at the time the focus is the snails, dredge material would not be suitable or allowed to go to open water disposal sites. And as you guys know, open water disposal is the most cost-effective way that you can handle dredge material. So we, in the last few months this fall, reached back out to the DMMP and said, has anything changed or new information come to bear that would change your determination, and would open water disposal be viable? And they said no, at this time we would still not allow either initial dredging or maintenance dredging that contains the New Zealand mud snail to go to open water. So, yes. So what that means is that the dredge material under any alternative needs to have an alternative disposal, which points you to upland disposal because of the agency's determination that due to the risk of spreading, you also can't beneficially reuse that within the water to create shoreline habitat, for example, within Mud Inlet, due to that risk. So that's what Tessa was speaking to, with the most cost-effective approach here really being incorporation and reuse of that dredge material to support one of the project goals of ecological habitat enhancement or improvements with the creation of the habitat in the lower basins.
So if this is okay for us to reuse the dredge material upland in the same body of water, it's not going to get rid of the snails, right?
No, that's exactly right. They're already located within these basins. So moving them from one north basin to the middle basin doesn't have an environmental impact. We're not spreading it, but part of the EIS includes an adaptive management plan, and like Tessa spoke to, the aquatic species invasive and nuisance evaluation that ties in and is interrelated as well.
So if we are going to let people go on and boat and fish on a body of water that has the snails, why can't we access it? And why are we letting it scenario where people can't get on the water now because there's like, oh, you can't spread the snail. We're gonna be potentially spreading the snail on dogs' feet and our boots and.
Well, and I think that's what we're going to be looking into, and like
How to
Cousin
manage
Jessie
that.
said, we'll be talking to the technical work group this afternoon. Their invasive species specialist is going to be there. So, I mean, there's just a lot to investigate.
Yeah.
So some of
This
it
is
is
like
preliminary.
But it's really, if you think about it.
So part of that evaluation, like Tessa said, is the potential options and approaches for control or eradication of the snail. And let's just focus on the snail for sake of this discussion. But then there's also the management or decon or whatnot to facilitate access if you didn't have eradication of the snail. So there's a couple different pieces here that tie into effective use while recognizing that you don't want to spread invasive species.
I have a related question.
Yeah.
If you take dredge material from the North Basin that has New Zealand mud snails in it and put it in the the upland basins, you're potentially putting more New Zealand mud snails up there. Could that make the problem worse?
Part of what the team will be looking at, I think there's only been a preliminary assessment of the density of snails and if that changes through the basin. My understanding in the past is that it wasn't something where there's a great density in the north and we're increasing the density besides just moving physically the sediment. So, but it's something to be evaluated.
Are there ways to deal with this sediment? I mean, are we looking at the most cost, I mean, like starting with the cheapest and kind of going down the list, and there's other ways? Or is this the only, what other ways exist to deal with this sediment? Like, let's say it was just too damaging to the middle and, you know, ecologically damaging, then what would you do? What comes next on the list?
Trying to dry it out and haul it off to a landfill.
That's the most expensive.
Yeah. I mean, that's
Yeah.
that's upland disposal generally. I mean,
Yeah.
unless you can find some other place where you can find if you can find some place that it will be allowed to be reused in some other beneficial fashion, there might be an in between. But with snails and loosestrife, it becomes hard to find an appropriate other option.
And then with this sediment as well, upland reuse of sediment is so largely dependent on the geotechnical suitability to use. So sometimes you can do that if you're amending it or augmenting it with fill material that then allows you to fill, you know, an excavation area to build on, let's say, for example. But this is a significant volume of sandy, silty type sediment that's not geotechnically suitable for reuse in the uplands. So you do end up with, like what Stephen was describing, trucking, transport, and upland disposal at a very premium dollar, or looking at, because we know open water disposal is off the table, how do we beneficially reuse this in the system to maximize the ecological function? So that's where we're at now.
And this animal, or loosestrife you mentioned, what is that?
It looks actually quite pretty. It's a purple color, but it's
Yeah.
very invasive.
So,
Like the water version of lupin.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good way to say it.
I guess my question is more generic, and that relates to what's the purpose of the call-out boxes here? They're, in part, they describe the action, but in part, they go on to talk about, to some degree, some of the goals or some of the environmental analysis. There are some pretty significant value-laden statements buried, particularly in the latter part of each of these boxes. It seems like it's a partial analysis already of what these are. If in fact this is supposed to be here's just the facts, this is what this is, then I suggest you remove some of that value-laden stuff about improved water quality or, I increase the goals or?
Like the transition to wetlands, those last couple sentences that say freshwater wetlands would also support water quality goals and would reduce the extent of dredging, those would
Improve
there.
ecological function, I mean, those are value-weighted statements that that's what will be evaluated in the EIS. This seems to presuppose a conclusion. And if you look at any one of these, there's a number of these things buried in here, and I talked about it at the previous, and I see you made some adjustments for that, but I think you need to look at what is the purpose of these figures. If it's simply to describe the alternative, then I suggest you remove all that evaluative language and just describe the alternative and stick to the facts at this point.
So I want to echo Pete's concern. We talked about this on, was it Monday phone meeting? And I appreciate your responsiveness to some of the concerns that we discussed in that meeting that are evident in some of these maps. So I agree with Pete that some of the headings are actions, and some of them include explicit connections to the goals. Dredging, transition, adaptive management plan. But when they have explicit connections in the headings to goals, such as adaptive management plan to improve water quality, we're including both the action and the connection to the goal. And I think it is important to include both, but we want to be clear about where. And so you've got the connections to the goals in the little light-colored boxes under the headings.
So for example, to make sure, I think I'm understanding your point here. So for example, let's pick on these two as examples. So
Yeah.
adaptive management plan to improve water quality, if we were having the action and the goal, initial and maintenance dredging in the North Basin only to manage sediments, right? That would be marrying up the goal with the action.
Right, but I think if I'm hearing Pete correctly, and I think this is a good strategy, to just have the action in the title, as you do with most of them, just the action.
So that would be water quality adaptive management plan.
Something like that. And then you
Rather than improve.
How does this connect to the goals? You have those descriptions in the light colored boxes. And so then that structure is consistent throughout.
And I think, would this make sense to you guys, to your point, Mayor Komet, too? The intent was to communicate the key components of the alternatives that were selected to best achieve project goals. And so that tie to the goals is to say, here's why we chose this, and here's why it came out of the measurable evaluation process. But I completely understand what you're saying, so I wonder if, let's pick again on the freshwater wetlands. When it says freshwater wetlands would also support water quality goals.
Which one are we on? Transition
yeah.
to freshwater, yeah.
The last sentence there has two woods in it, so I'm kind of picking on it. Freshwater wetlands would also support water quality goals and would reduce the extent of dredging. That could be reworded to not presuppose the EIS technical analysis, to say freshwater wetlands to support water quality goals, right? It's more of a, this was selected to accomplish this goal. Not that we are necessarily committing that it will achieve that in the most effective way, because we haven't completed the analysis. But if we said to and just made some semantic changes, is that getting to your point, Mayor Komet? Because I do think we need to be able to communicate the basis of why the component is showing up on the tape, on the figure.
Right. And I totally agree. And we were trying to be extremely careful, and we'll go back through this with a fine-tooth comb to make sure that we weren't using any language that would presuppose, but rather making the connection, as Jesse described and Commissioner Zita pointed out, that something shows up as a component because it's heading us in the direction of managing sediment, improving water quality, enhancing.
could just, and maybe, words are very important here.
Definitely.
And so, maybe it's to address this, these,
That's what I was thinking, the
Yeah.
Stop.
right, rather than would,
but
Or could,
could.
it may or may not support it.
right.
Yeah.
You know, or,
You know, that was actually a key point yesterday
Yep.
made by Ray Peters as well. So on the managed lake alternative, when we were walking through similarly each of these components and we talked about the adaptive management plan to improve water quality, he made a similar comment that said, that would be your goal, but you haven't done the analysis to demonstrate you would achieve that goal.
Right.
It was exactly, I think, where he was coming from too. So I think that's a good comment to go through, and we'll, you know, it can be a water quality adaptive management plan without the improve to be more consistent. And where we say would, we could say could or to, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
We've already done a little bit of this, because
Right.
I noticed there was a couple of changes from the draft.
Yes,
And Amy and I were driving Salmon Recovery Council yesterday, and we were discussing that. And now I
exactly.
looked at your new
Yep.
drafts, and you've changed it. So you're,
Oh, thank you for reviewing in that detail. That is so awesome. That's right.
you are onto this concept. It's just that maybe we need to go a little further.
Fine tune a little more. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
you
I like
changed
the
a
to
bunch of,
address, not to support.
Okay.
you changed a bunch of wills to mays, and that's
Yeah.
great, yeah.
even in that first sentence in that box,
For the wet.
establishing freshwater wetlands in the south and middle basins would promote ecological diversity.
Yeah.
Well, one could argue that we already have freshwater wetlands now, at least in parts of this that are not very diverse. They're, you know, they're a wasteland. So, again, I think that even that is a valuable statement. So think of, you know, maybe it's to enhance current wetlands, to address,
Well, and promote is consistent with that, right? If it said to promote or to, yeah, I mean, to promote ecological diversity, I feel like that would meet your intent there instead of would.
Or could.
Could, either way. I,
Yeah.
yeah. Jeff had a question.
you know, just.
What is the purpose of these? Where do they come into play? How are they presented? What are they used for?
Great question. The purpose is because we want to transparently convey to the stakeholders what will be evaluated in the environmental impact statement. And for example, the managed lake alternative that you see in these diagrams are different than some other managed lake options that have been put forward in the past, which, for example, included dredging throughout all of the basin. This does not, and there are specific reasons why it does not. And so rather than doing that analysis sort of behind closed doors and just putting out an alternative in the draft, we would like to engage with the stakeholders, show them what came out of the measurable evaluation process and what we'll be evaluating, and take it into that evaluation.
So this is to be used prior to the EIS?
Yeah, well, and stakeholders include engagement of the work groups. It's our way, with our time we have with each work group, to bring forward the overview of the optimized alternative, to get your input like this, to talk it through. These then move forward. These are interim materials, living materials that are just to convey the status update and understanding of what came out of that MEF, measurable evaluation process. And then the team moves forward to do the technical analysis in the EIS, where the design also gets to advance because we're done with the sediment transport modeling. So these are expected to look a little different because they're informed by that work and that design. And then in the EIS, there's the graphics of the optimized alternative that will look different than these because we would have completed the technical work. So these are an interim tool for us to communicate out what came out of the MEP to meet our project goals and what's going into the technical analysis.
Well, I think it's a little bit problematic that, I mean, I guess theoretically, these will be discarded once you get to the EIS. And it's not the alternative, but the information you're conveying with this graphic.
Yeah, we have more certainty, but the bones of it and everything, this is the foundation of what moves forward.
Well,
But
that's
keep
what-
going so I can understand, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, when you use words like optimized, it's confounding as to what criteria you're using to reach that conclusion. And, you know, normally you would be weighing the positive and the negative, and you're just reflecting some of the positive on here without any considerations.
Exactly, so like we
Of the
talked in
negative.
June, the term optimized was used to convey the myriad of alternatives and components on the table going into the measurable evaluation process. Out of that evaluation, that funneling and filtering, the graphic has this shape for a reason. There is the optimized one managed lake, one estuary, one hybrid that goes into the EIS. When these are, I make it sound like it's a magical place like Disneyland, this EIS. But when these are in the EIS, they're no longer optimized, they're just the alternatives. They move forward, and then we have the work that we do and the results of the analysis, so that, like Tessa was saying, then graphically, now the goals and the components selected to achieve the goals marries up with the impacts. We look at it, we get to look at it holistically.
Yeah, well, I guess it's the Disneyland aspect of it that's problematic, because, you know, you're implying that there's this measurable evaluation process, but you've narrowed the criteria that you've incorporated into that process, such that you're not presenting a full reflection of the alternative and the implication of the alternatives. For example, I mean, I don't know, I'm not recalling what criteria you used in regard to, say, for example, regulatory authority. You know, I mean, you can do the Disneyland version, but is it reasonable to permit it? So when you say it's optimized, you're implying, you're creating a value there that this is the best outcome for this particular concept of alternative. But you're not necessarily reflecting the reality of it.
Well, you could answer here too. I mean, go ahead and then.
I think perhaps what you're asking, Jeff, is there documentation of what's been eliminated through that measurable evaluation process to allow us to say that this really did come out on top? Like, for example, you know, let's just pick on the Middle Basin again. There is a version of the managed lake that has that fully dredged. And then it was compared to a version of the managed lake that has transitioned to freshwater wetlands. And when you compare those two concepts against the technical feasibility, the regulatory feasibility, the environmental sustainability and ability to meet project goals, and economic sustainability, this version is the version that scores the best and is the optimized way to sort of deliver.
I get that, you know, you're trying to create some kind of analysis within the silo of these particular concepts. But you're comparing them against each other and then calling it an optimized, where, I mean, it seems to almost be jumping into the EIS analysis without presenting all the information. I'm just...
So I hear you say this is aspirational.
Yes, and more transparent than typically what would be done within an EIS. So I think that's where we're opening up to make sure that we can convey these steps as we're going through the EIS, where usually this would be just part of the analysis that would proceed. So that's where you're getting an interim piece that is trying to reflect a first step of the analysis, but we're not through the rest of the steps yet. So
Do these represent a complete description of each of these alternatives in your mind?
Say again, Pete?
I would say that the question was, do these represent a complete description of the alternatives in your mind? And I would say the answer to that is these are the best representation of the alternatives with the primary, the fundamental components that help to achieve project goals. But recognizing that there will be other things that are added as a result of our analysis. For example, if we saw a potential impact if we see a potential impact from sediment transport, we could consider adding a sediment trap, for example. That would be part of our approach to maintaining or managing sediment management, but still fits within what you see here.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to let our analysis tell us, do we add or tweak things while starting with the bones that are represented on these figures.
Well, sediment management is a good example of that, because one of the suggestions I know I had made was, part of that is managing the sediment in the river, that looking at what is done in the river. So, but there's no call-out box for looking at that as part of this. So, I mean, so my understanding, just what you're saying is, this is the description of the alternatives that we are going to analyze in the EIS. We've been presented with dozens of suggestions throughout this scoping process, but this is what we've narrowed it down to as representative of what we're going to analyze in the EIS. So I'll go back to make sure these are descriptive as best you can, and keep this to describing what the alternative is and less about what we're trying to achieve with this element of it, or what is expected as a result of this element. I think it would be cleaner that way, and then you avoid the again, this feeling that this is sort of predisposing a particular outcome or result of that analysis. So I think that would be the approach I would suggest. And then, if indeed your expectation is that other parts of sediment analysis, sediment management are going to be included in this in some way, you can call that out in a box, or say, sediment management, it will look at these 3 or 4 things, not just dredging in the inlet, but also potentially a sediment trap somewhere, potentially sediment control upstream, and again, describe the alternative that you're analyzing. I think that will get you where you want to be without getting into these types of issues.
Did we close on that one? I want to jump in before we kind of close that conversation.
Oh, you'll be good. Go ahead.
I guess one of the things when I first looked at these and was sort of trying to connect these concepts to how it impacts lot, for example. I didn't see the connection between water quality improvement in any of these alternatives and downstream water quality, because that's where we live. And so it seemed to me that the water quality discussion here, and maybe some of this discussion we've been talking about will eliminate that, because we're not really going to imply there's anything until we know there's something. But the thing that I couldn't find a connection to, so for example, contrasting that to sediment, there's an obvious connection with where sediment deposits. So if you change the equation here, it changes where sediment deposits. But I don't see the same relationship as a goal about downstream water quality, because clearly that's, ecology has made that an issue. Ecology has said that one of these alternatives does not fix that problem. So we talk about water quality improvement here, but the fact of the matter is it's water quality improvement here
In the lake, you mean?
in the lake, but it's not water quality improvement downstream where it affects us. So, or at least I can't speak
No, I
deep science on that, but you know, the fact of the matter is we live in a world at lot where we have to overproduce to reduce nutrient loading during the warm weather sunny season, because the level of available oxygen just simply isn't there, and so it's very constrained. So we produce nitrogen removal at a level that's just practically minuscule. And so the impact of any of this on nutrient loading, either removing nutrients from the downstream, then that raises, it lifts that bar up. So I'm just trying, I
Well,
just couldn't see that connection.
I think you were spot on that second point of the statement you were making to say, but if we're not quite there yet, it's the perfect discussion going back to we're ahead of the technical analysis where that's what gets evaluated. And I think that the dialogue we're having is at the heart of the questions we put forward to you guys too. How do we effectively convey this touch point ahead of some of the analysis? How best do we help stakeholders understand the differences between the alternatives and the basis of these components? So I think to your point, the valuation of water quality and the impacts, I mean, really what you're speaking to are the benefits and impacts of the alternatives. That's what's not captured here yet, because these are just the components. But that's the heart of what the evaluation is. I mean, it totally makes sense.
Yet they're all labeled as in an equal way. And I think that's, Mike was making one example of it. I think that's part of what I was trying to say is, I think you're presenting it in a way where you're trying to be completely neutral. I understand that it's
Ahead
a
of the analysis,
transitional
yes,
process.
because we
where
don't
you're
want to
ahead.
presuppose.
Exactly,
Yeah.
and it's not completely neutral. So, I mean, good luck. I don't think you can achieve what you're trying to do. And that's why we're all struggling with how to label it, how to characterize it.
Yeah, it's not easy, for sure. Can we look at the, keep going just so.
That's kind of what I was thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm cheating, I'm looking ahead, I'm like,
Yeah.
but some of this stuff might be answered from looking at the other
Yeah.
models and come back to that.
Just so that you can get a sense of these.
Definitely. Okay, so we're at the top still, but I'll try to go quickly.
Well, you made it to wetlands. You're the middle.
I wanted to just mention that, so the takeaway for dredging in the managed lake alternative is that it's focused in the North Basin. The initial dredge material helps to establish our Middle Basin and South Basin wetlands. The material from our maintenance dredging and the frequency of maintenance dredging will be defined by recreational goals in the North Basin area. And that maintenance dredging material is likely to go off-site. So,
So that's gonna go, okay. Maintenance dredging will go outside, so we're still gonna have that big expense.
okay, so moving down from there, on to our next one. Transition to freshwater wetlands in the South and Middle Basin. So as we've described, we would establish freshwater wetlands in the South and Middle Basins, and there would be a mix of bank riparian and upland habitat zones targeting that floodplain deciduous forest. The actual type of species and ratio would be developed during the permitting process, but our biologists are looking at habitat types and general categories for our analysis. And the intent of doing this was to increase ecological function. That would be the purpose of this component. So switching down to the adaptive management plan, I'm trying to go quickly here, is, once we establish that habitat, we need to maintain it. And so the adaptive management plan for ecological functions would really do two things. It would ensure that the performance goals that are established for the habitat are met, and also to reduce and manage the invasive and noxious species, as we've discussed. I'm going to continue progressing clockwise. You'll see in the managed lake alternative that there is now a presentation of a boardwalk adjacent to the ecological improvements, and that is a result of the continued expression of value around community use of the resource.
And that's in all the alternatives.
Correct, that is in all the alternatives, yep. Similarly, the restoration of boating and fishing is a result of the other improvements and is present in all of the alternatives. And then finally, the last note on here is that the managed lake does assume an adaptive and active approach to water quality. So water quality simply needs to be managed under this alternative actively, and this alternative does assume that. And the environmental impact statement will evaluate different approaches to improving water quality under the managed lake alternative. Oh, that was quick. Okay, so estuary, switching over to the estuary. This is the same setup with the same caveats and baseline goals on the bottom. I'm gonna switch around the sequence. It's not gonna be nice clockwise like we did last time. I'd like to start with initial dredging in the middle and north basin channels. So this assumes dredging would be targeted in the middle and north basins and targeted within the main channel and secondary channels. We'll identify and develop the main channel through our numerical modeling. This presentation is our best representation right now without having done that analysis. But the dredging plan would also be designed to allow that channel to be submerged in most tidal elevations. This assumes that there's no dredging in the South Basin at this point, and it also, it'll continue to be refined with the modeling. Bumping down from there is establishing shoreline habitat within the middle and north basins. So when the initial dredge event occurs during construction, that initial material, just like the managed lake alternative, will be brought to the shorelines of the middle and south basins to construct shoreline habitat. And the purpose of that is to, twofold, is to increase or promote habitat diversity and to beneficially reuse that sediment within the basin. The mudflats would be the predominant habitat type in the estuary alternative. The coverage, of course, would vary due to water levels, and along the shorelines in the habitat that we establish, those species and types and ratios would be defined through the permitting process, but are expected to include low marsh, high marsh, transitional, and upland habitat zones. I am now going to switch over to the top left. The removal, after we do the initial dredge event in the middle and north basins, and then we establish the shoreline habitat, the Fifth Avenue Dam would be removed, and we've evaluated the opening. There have been a number of suggestions put out there. We will be evaluating a 500-foot opening, so the larger opening, to best meet, to best restore tidal flow and flushing throughout the basin. From here, I'm gonna move over to the right, which is our maintenance dredging. And so Maintenance dredging would occur, would be a recurring event as part of the estuary, and the maintenance dredging locations would be defined following our numerical modeling, so understanding where the locations of deposition are, but then also understanding potential areas of impact. So all of that deposition might not be an impact. Some of it might. We would work through that process and use our modeling impacts and mitigation measures to define that, and also the frequency. Jeff? Yes.
I think your narrative's okay, but it may be problematic to, as you've graphically depicted the location of that as being fairly specific. Your dot just goes to right there at the opening.
Okay.
When in fact, I presume, based on subsequent modeling and analysis, it could be anywhere from there to the turning basin. I mean, theoretically, it could be the best place to do maintenance dredging is in the turning basin. So I just think graphically you might want to represent that area could be broader than what you depicted.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
We just didn't want to, if the dot, if we were to, for kids, so isn't it funny, we're hearing we need to be consistent, but if we had a leader line and moved that dot out, then they'd say, well, you picked that place further out, why did you pick it, right? So it's put close to indicate that it's still, open, that's why it says the locations to be determined, you're totally right.
So rather than, I hate to be a graphic designer here, but rather than put a little dot, put a big oval or a big shaded area, or something that depicts the, it's broader.
All right. Took that note, Jeff, thank you. So I'm gonna pop down to the bottom now for the adaptive management plan. This is also similar to all alternatives, common to all alternatives. It'll look different, of course, but essentially this is saying that establishing that habitat, we would need to define our the way that we would maintain it and meet the performance goals, and also reduce or control invasive species. And then the remaining two left on this diagram are the boardwalk, which is common to all alternatives, as we've discussed, and then the restoration of boating and fishing. Of course, that may look different, again, under the alternative types, but those are common to all alternatives. I know I'm going really quickly here, but the last thing that I wanted to mention is that on the bottom left of this diagram, go ahead and switch the page, you'll see that there is an inset that shows, that shows what this might look like under high tide elevations. And in our environmental impact statement, we would be looking at that through modeling and then also through visual simulations. But we just wanted to represent that this is one snapshot of a tidal elevation to best show the different features, but there's of course tidal movement.
Just a quick question. It says mean high or high water.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what you mean high or high water.
It's a common measure of generally high tide. We have our high tide cycles, so anyway, it's generally considered high tide, but it's more technical. I mean, it's like I could give you the full description, but I think that's probably too much.
There's two highs.
Okay.
It's the
The
higher
mean
of
of the higher.
It's like the nav channel has to be
You can get totally baked.
It's like the nav channel has to be 25 feet minimum at mean lower low.
Oh, okay. Thank you for that. And then, I feel like I should have brought this up originally. Where does sea level rise fit into these scenarios?
We will be evaluating sea level rise under all of the alternatives, including the no action alternative. And that just gets us back to this being a component, and we'll have to look at the impacts in the EIS.
That's obviously really impacting our downtown. And, people would look at what we currently have as a retaining wall along the east side of the lake. And if we do this hybrid, that would continue around, and that could be
possible that the restored estuary would provide more resilience in high water events.
Exactly. So, but it's still in the.
So, again, apologize, I do have to leave early. Who should I call at some point to talk about the update on the community planning board?
Carrie and Tessa?
Yeah, that's fine, we can follow up with you.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Thank you.
Have a good Thanksgiving.
See you, Jeff.
Oh, yeah, that's too far away to worry about at this point. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff.
Okay, so I know this has been quick. I'm going to switch to the hybrid alternative. On these, on this image, I just wanted to point out two things, and those are the differentiators. In large part, the foundation of this alternative is similar to or the same as the estuary alternative, with the exception of this barrier wall that allows the eastern portion of the North Basin to be retained as a reflecting pool. And so the two differences that I'll just point here are kind of midway down the right-hand column, the multimodal trail on the retaining wall at the reflecting pool. So this is to say that on top of that barrier wall, there will be the ability for bikes and pedestrians to use that as a resource. And Stephen, did you want to describe how big it'll be around? This is his favorite part.
We tweaked it to be exactly a mile, just because we thought that would be nice for runners.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So,
Circumference of a mile?
yes.
The whole loop is a mile.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's what I need.
Yeah, he's an engineer.
And like 14 feet wide, which is actually pretty consistent with the new WashDOT standards for 520, which has been very successful in accommodating a lot of different types of users.
You got a rollerblading lane?
Not a special lane, but space for all.
Do you know about what it is for the managed lake? The circumference of the...
The current lake is about 1.5 miles, a little bit more.
And that would not change, of course.
Yeah, in the North Basin.
Just for comparison.
Yeah.
And so the last thing to note under the hybrid is that there would be an adaptive management plan that would address water quality within the reflecting pool. So we just want to say that.
So, within this little, like,
Yes.
so that was going to be my question.
Okay.
And so the adaptive management plan is pointing way down at the bottom.
For ecological functions.
Right, but you're going to have some serious adaptive management, with some kind of management inside that lake.
That's up in the upper left or one,
It's,
second
yeah.
block down.
Which one?
That what, the
So-
water.
That's the new one. Okay, great, good, thank you.
And so when it says there at the bottom, consider flushing of reflecting pools may be possible by tidal gate.
Mhm.
I mean, how, I mean, you did some screening, some kind to create this optimized alternative, and I'm imagining there'll be more exploration of that, but how feasible is that, sitting where we sit today?
I mean, as far as getting,
The efficacy of this tidal gate proposal to flush and clean the
Yeah.
water in this lake.
actually, we have quite a bit of flexibility in how much water we let in and out at this stage. So that's part of the reason this thing moved forward is we have the most ability to, either allow it to be 5 feet of exchange or 3 feet of exchange. All of what kind of the analysis shows we need to push through enough water. We're going to have the ability to do that, and even beyond that, we could go beyond and allow more exchange in the summer and less in the winter, which might be good for reducing the amount of sediment coming in the winter into that basin, but having more exchange for water quality in the summer. So there are options by having an additional valve on the tide gate so that perhaps only 2 are effective in the winter, and then a third one that's lower you could have being part of the process in the summer to get more water moving through there.
Do you know what the loop is around Green Lake?
Yeah, it's a bit more. Something I don't remember
behind that, exchanging water, if the reason why we're exchanging water in that lake is to improve the water quality in the lake, then what you're doing is then releasing all of that organic matter out into the lower Bud Inlet during the worst time of the year. So I think you need to think of it in both ways. It's not just sediment management, it's water quality management as well.
That's fair. I mean, and that's sort of, I think, where we can get back to the EIS pushing us to what is the right number by the analysis of both the sediment and the water quality elements. I think get a play into changing these in the future.
And the water would, sorry, this is my question.
Yeah.
So the water that would be flushing back and forth would be estuary water, so it would be a mixture of salt and fresh.
Yes.
So people, it's important for people to know too that are thinking maybe they could swim in it or something. I don't know what that means, but okay.
Any additional input or questions?
I have another dumb question about this.
Oh,
So,
they've been good.
I mean, the water's coming down the river, that's the whole point, fresh water from the river, but we have, the salt water. So this exchange and flow, can you just kind of walk me through how that works? Like,
Yeah.
where's the water going? You keep saying letting it in, letting it out, it's going
Yeah.
which way?
I wish I had a board I could
From where
start
to where?
drawing on. So there are, in the wall that separates the two, there are these tide valves, and at low tide, they essentially by gravity would be sitting open, and the bottom of the valve is kind of the lowest point where water could go out of the pool area and into the estuary. And as the tide rose, it would come past that low point and then start feeding in to the pool. So once it got up to a certain level, it would actually start lifting floats on that valve, and that would shut the gate, and then actually water pressure would hold that valve closed, and it would stop flow from going into there. So your highest one would actually determine the maximum amount of water elevation you would have on the pool side. So we could control it from getting, say, too much in there, which is good for certain elements of the design. So as the water starts coming down on the other side, the valves pop open, and then the water pressure pushes out, and then that water is able to go back out into the estuary. And so depending on how many valves you put, it's really depending on what the number of valves determines the velocity of the water that's going in there, and the elevation difference will determine the amount of volume, so that you can plan and look at the total exchange that you need. And there's even things that you can do to plan so that the water comes in at a lower amount potentially, it mixes, and then can come out at whatever elevation you kind of want to pull it off at. So there's different things you can do in the design to help work on the mixing and how it exchanges.
And where exactly are these gates on the lake?
They would be along the wall. Again, that's a level of design as to exactly where they're put that hasn't been determined yet.
So we see this connection between the little lake and the hydrant.
Yeah.
And the Bud Inlet side, the saltwater side. And,
And
there should be a connection, I
Well, that's
imagine,
in low
between the
tide.
freshwater,
Yeah.
well,
between the freshwater side to let the clean river water in.
yeah, and that connection is a little bit deceptive. It is not necessarily intended to be showing a lake there. That's where the current basin happens to be naturally deep, that we're putting that across. And so on this graphic, it shows us sort of maintaining there because we didn't fill it in. In my idea, in low tide, which is the main part of the graphic, there probably wouldn't be any water flowing in and out because we would be wanting to maintain the pool quite a bit above that.
But there would be some mechanism for allowing the
Yes.
fresh, clean water from the river into the lake or not?
I think as the salt water's coming in and the river's coming down, you will have some mixing. I do think you will, as the beginning parts of that tide rising, you will be getting more fresh and slightly brackish, but as the tide goes up more, and if it gets beyond that zone, you're starting to be seeing more of the salt, or the stuff coming from the inlet coming in.
So we're not envisioning a connection between the clean fresh river water and the little lake.
There's nothing to capture just river water separate from the lake. We actually talked about that, but we were concerned about essentially sort of taking that water's availability to fish and other
Right,
habitat
yeah.
that we
Yeah.
thought would be
Its
too big of
ecological
a...
function and
Yeah.
putting the dissolved oxygen into bud inlet is a higher priority.
Yeah, maintaining all of that, habitat with the water. And, at a certain point, the amount you required for the pool could exceed the amount coming out of the river, and that would be problematic.
And where are the priorities? Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We should
Do you
do
have any
a
idea?
process check and just, we've got 4 minutes. So, I mean, we can certainly, we've got the rooms, so we can go a little bit long, but I want to respect everyone's calendars too, and just kind of check in and see how we
I was just wanting to know if you have any idea what the refresh rate needs to be on that reflecting pool. So how much water has to move through there on a daily average to keep it at its desired height? Do you have any idea what that is?
There was some numbers that were looked at back in 2007 about the amount of time any amount of water is staying in the current lake. I think it was like 7 days or something like that in the summer. And that previous work, when it was looking at the saltwater exchange pool, had been pushing that down to 3 and had felt that would be an improvement, but really it hadn't gotten to the step of doing the water quality analysis. And so I don't feel like I can really say much more than we can do a lot better than what it was as far as that, but.
Well, the reason I'm asking is because from time to time in this whole discussion over the years, there's been a suggestion that it might be another receding place for reclaimed water.
Mhm.
So I'm just trying to get a sense of what the volumes we might be talking about to have to continue to refresh it when it.
So I think that's a different scenario
It
than
is.
they're talking about, because up until now, I think people have been envisioning this as a freshwater lake. You're talking about it's going to be a saltwater lake. So that's what.
Well, I guess that's a point.
Totally different, really.
And I think
And
what,
using, so that impacts the growth of algae and all the other issues as well. So that addresses the water quality. Because if you make that a shallow freshwater lake, you're just gonna have a mini North Basin.
Yeah.
All of the problems that North Basin has, which are algae growth and aquatic plants and all of that. So by making it saltwater, you eliminate that aspect, but you also no longer are talking about a freshwater feed into that lake at that point. That's
Well,
a
I don't
different
know that we
concept.
rule it out entirely, it depends on volume. but-
True, yeah.
but,
I mean, you might be able to some, but.
I mean, obviously, if we're gonna use reclaimed water to enhance the inflow characteristics of the Deschutes, we probably need to be up higher than, when it push comes to shove, if it needed water at some point.
Right, yeah.
so I think that we can capture a little bit of at least one more item very quickly, and then let's decide what we want to do with the CSB update and that. But I think what you're honing in on are some of the significant considerations evaluated or ahead of us in the EIS,
Yeah.
particularly when we think about not just the technical feasibility, but also environmental sustainability, and kind of thinking about that. You're really honing in on the analysis and considerations. I would just jump us really quick, because I know some folks need to go. To give you a sense, we are anticipating that we would next meet with you in April. We recognize that Washington's spring break is that first week of April, so we're looking at potentially having the work group meetings later that month. If there's anyone that knows you will be gone in April, if there's a certain week, let us know now, but we'd be sending you a doodle poll after the holiday to find the best window of availability for everyone. And really, in part of that, that's allowing us to, well, get through the holidays from a logistical consideration, but continue to move forward and do our work. So April is our next time that we would connect together.
I know I'm not the assigned person here, but the Salish Sea Ecosystem Conference is in Vancouver, like, I think it's the 19th of April, like right around 18th, 19th.
Okay.
It goes from like Sunday through Wednesday or something.
Where's that located?
Vancouver.
Got it,
So
okay.
They flipped from Vancouver to Seattle. I'm
Is
gonna be
it
there.
Canada or Washington?
Canada.
That might matter too.
It wouldn't matter to some of the people involved.
For the technical work group, yeah, that's a good point, okay. So we wanted to give you a sense of that timing as well. And then, what do you think? Did you guys want to just do a 2-minute CSB update, or did you want to follow up via email with anything on that with the work group?
I was gonna say, since Jeff has already left, maybe we could just kind of come up with some bullet points to summarize. and-
Totally.
That's what I was wondering
We had a
too.
great meeting, but yeah, we'll
Yeah.
maybe send that out to everyone. I would like to check in with our public though and see.
Yeah, yeah. So before we do that, I'll just say that what would be coming to you guys would be draft meeting summary, and when we transmit that, we'll include a doodle poll for April. And then probably in a separate email transmittal, that overview of the CSB meeting.
What's CSB?
Community Sounding Board.
Okay.
Yep. Thank you so much for coming today too. Your input was really helpful. And then with that, as Carrie mentioned, just our rolling standing agenda item of opening up for a comment from the public. Steve?
I have a very statement. I would like to address the issue of Delhi not being the hybrid alternative. This is completely unfair and unfounded. The hybrid alternative was not put forth in the scoping process, nor was it presented or backed by any citizens. It's a made-up idea devised to fill the requirement of a hybrid alternative to the EIS. Delhi, on the other hand, has been involved with this process from the beginning and was fully entered into the public record during the scoping process. Delhi also addresses every major aspect being reviewed in the EIS, including fish and wildlife benefits, water quality improvements, public recreation, sediment management, and sea level rise. Delhi also is supported by a large and growing portion of the public. The email list has over 1,000 names and increases weekly, while many times more people than that have given verbal support. Now, I don't mean this as a threat, it's really a heads up. The people I talk to about Delhi often become passionate when they finally hear an idea that makes sense to them. They are sick and tired of this endless chant of all lake or all estuary that has gotten us nowhere forever. And the compromise of Delhi makes sense to them. If Delhi is not the hybrid alternative put forth in the draft EIS, DES would be ending up people storming their front door with pitchforks and torches. Finally, I feel I had put in the time and should have the credibility to where someone owes me an answer as to why Delhi is not the hybrid alternative. Thank you, all ears.
Thank you, Steve. I think maybe we can set up a time when we can kind of walk through some things with you and have a back and forth about those different components. Does that make sense?
Why is the hybrid alternative one that was not presented in the scope? You essentially adapted the wall of Delhi, but now it's not freshwater. Why is that?
Should we talk about that in the meeting?
Are we gonna have a response, or are we gonna hear the public comment?
Yeah, I think we should discuss this with you, Steve, in detail. And it would be great if you would be open to submitting your comment. And we can use that as an opportunity to put something on the calendar. Yeah, we'll take that.
That would be great, thank you.
And then hear other comments. Because I think we could use some time.
Yeah, to walk through everything.
Mine is dramatic, but on these, the diagrams you show for the estuary and hydro that's gonna be balanced with the ecological services of that particular issue. So, the cost of upland disposal, or moving the dredge spoils to the Miller South Basin with the snail still in it is, we're thinking about that in terms of what that means for, the overall ecosystem assessment for what needs to get done. And I think that's the whole point of the EIS, but I want to say that because I never hear you say it. And then also, I have a question about whether or not the estuary is considered a historic resource, like the buildings and everything else, because the estuary was there before anything else was. So how does that get factored in? That's all.
Thank you. Anything else from the public? All right. With that, I think we will adjourn. Thank you for those few extra minutes. We appreciate it.